Welcome to Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock podcast. My name is Michał Oleszczyk and I'm accompanied as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smoliński.
This is the sixth episode of our podcast in which we discuss all Alfred Hitchcock films in chronological order. Last time we discussed The Ring, and now we are still in the British International Pictures period of Alfred Hitchcock's filmography, and we move on to 1928 and a film of The Farmer's Wife, another adaptation in Hitchcock's early filmography, and this time it's a film based on a stage play, actually on a quite successful stage play of that time by Eden Philpotts. We'll see how we like The Farmer's Wife. Actually, today we haven't discussed the film yet before switching the recording on, so we don't know yet if we like the film or not. We didn't discuss it before that. So, Sebastian, this is a little bit suspenseful. How did you like The Farmer's Wife?
I would say my attitude towards the movie is pretty favorable. I liked it. What I find surprising is that this movie is very divisive among critics and Hitchcock scholars. And I think, thinking about this period, these years of 1927, 8 up to 1932, I realized that maybe my approach to Hitchcock in previous episodes was a bit misplaced. What I mean is that, we discuss every movie separately, and we treat it as this finished work of art that was fully under Hitchcock's control. But when you realize that he was not only overworked in 1927, because he actually finished shooting The Farmer's Wife in 1927, it premiered in 1928, but his next 4 years at British International Pictures were equally challenging and full of work. So he signed this contract, 12-picture 3-year deal. So he had to produce, 3-4 pictures a year. So actually he was shooting one movie after another. And I wonder if, for example, The Farmer's Wife wasn't one of these, between more important or ambitious assignments project.
Mm-hmm. Well, we still need to remember that we are talking about a very young man. He's still in his 20s. He still didn't pass the age of 30. So he's full of energy, that's for sure. And the 1928 is important because this is the year of the birth of his daughter, Patricia Hitchcock, who was born in July 1928. So this is really the prime of his life. He's newlywed, his daughter is being born, he's still under 30, and he's directing his sixth feature film. So I would say that, and actually a film based on a successful play, and a film that is a success. So definitely we can sense, I think, in that movie that it comes from a rather brighter place, let's say, in Hitchcock's psyche. The ending is actually unqualifying. I mean, it's purely happy ending. But the plot of the film, just to summarize it very briefly, has to do with a widower who's by name of Samuel Sweetland, played by Jameson Thomas, who, his wife dies at the very beginning of the film, and then he goes through this sort of repeated cycle of courtship and rejection when he's trying to find a replacement for his wife. After he marries off his daughter, he has one daughter in the film. Apparently there were two daughters in the play. Once he marries off his daughter, he feels the pang of loneliness. He wants to marry again, and the whole idea of the play and on the film is that the best candidate for his wife is right under his nose. That's actually his housekeeper, Minta, played by Lillian Hall Davis. We saw her already in The Ring, and basically the whole dynamics is him coming to the realization that Minta is the one, is actually the perfect candidate, and he goes through this cycle of actually 4 rejections. 3 of them we see on screen, and the 4th is off screen. And I can honestly say that I didn't like The Farmer's Wife. Actually, possibly this is my least favorite of all Hitchcock silents. Well, we'll see if actually I should be that harsh, but because I do see some merits. But what I really dislike is the comedy in the film. I think it's very crass, and the portrayals of the women in those courtship scenes, that are unqualifiedly horrible. I mean, there are caricatures of this exaggerated, bloated femininity that Hitchcock apparently and quite vocally mocked in real life and in his films. There will be many women like that, especially middle-aged women with some obesity and usually single, who in many Hitchcock films, even in Rope and in Shadow of the Doubt, in many of those films, there will be those very unfavorable portrayals. Yes, portrayals of them. So I dislike that fact, and also I find baffling, because I really like the Charles Barr book, English Hitchcock, that we often quote in this podcast, and he analyzes The Farmer's Wife very beautifully. He likes the film a lot. He says that it's one of the best silent films, but he completely avoids and omits the most problematic aspect of the film, which is the ending and the fact that Minta is really just in the story to fulfill the desires of Samuel. I am shocked that Barr doesn't mention the very beginning of the film, which is borderline obscene, when the last words of the dying words of the wife, like her last breath, is to Minta, don't forget to air master's pants. And then she dies, and we see Minta actually throughout the years washing the underpants of the master of the house, and there are repeated shots of just like the undergarments of that guy being hung in front of the fire outside, and we're just looking at his pants, like for the next couple of shots. So basically, this is a very brief description of what is the role of the wife and what is the role of the someone who will take care of him. And this is what makes her a perfect candidate. She's willing to accept this role of someone who just takes his dirty laundry and hangs it out to dry. So also in this aspect, I found it problematic, not because I want this to be a progressive fairy tale of independent woman. Just it seems very narrow-minded. It seems very set on this idea that Minta is simply there to finally fill the empty chair next to the fireplace.
Yes, I agree with most of you said, but I find The Farmer's Wife a bit more complicated, and I read it from a slightly different angle. I agree that the performance of Lillian, I mean the character played by Lillian Hall Davis is certainly there just to please her master, and of course also the let's say class inequalities between them, or rather he's her master, her employer, and then suddenly he realizes that that's the perfect wife. So this is not developed. I mean the relationship is really not developed. It's also not really erotic or whatever. So I agree with that part, but I found these several scenes really powerful. Maybe I will comment more upon it later. Why I find, for example, the exterior scenes really beautiful and something new in Hitchcock movies, because what we were discussing before were mostly movies set indoors. They had this stagey quality to them, most of them, and here we have this pastoral Hitchcock. I didn't find it fake. I think the opening scenes are really shot in a beautiful way, and we can feel that Hitchcock as a director really tries to convey the sense of space, the sense of the milieu he's portraying. I found it really something new in his movies and something that he will develop later, and that was missing from his other silents, to be honest, even from the better ones like The Ring, for example. So I liked his attempt, maybe this, like, let's say, faux realism that there is in several scenes. There is, for example, the wonderful scene with tens of dogs, which I think they are going hunting, right? So this is really, really beautiful. And also, but what I would say to kind of as a counter argument to what you said is that let's emphasize that these women refuse him 4 times, and these scenes are shot in a very striking way. Truffaut says that Hitchcock in this movie, he shoots the conversation scenes as a thriller, and there is something to it, because I think there is this movie shows strong anxiety in this man whose portrayal I still cannot grasp exactly what this character is about. So I'm not sure if he's just this, a slightly arrogant but a warm-hearted guy, or that he's really so high of himself that he doesn't understand that he's not such a good possible future husband. He's not such a hot widower that everyone wants to pursue. And of course, I was reminded of 7 Chances by Buster Keaton, which is totally different movie, but there is this anxiety on both sides. On the side of women who chase Buster because he will be rich soon if he will marry, right? And he's full of fear that he needs to find a wife, and he doesn't know how to do it. So there are some similarities, of course. Keaton's movie is a masterpiece. This one is certainly not, but I think there is some, let's say, speaking from a contemporary perspective, some kind of castration anxiety in this man. They really these scenes are shot in a way, the scenes in which women refuse him, and there is this strange contradiction that these women, as we mentioned, they are not portrayed by Hitchcock as beautiful women. On the opposite, this portrayal is slightly, or highly misogynistic. They are not attractive in a, common sense. But still they refuse his courtship. So I find it really interesting why do they refuse in the first place? And his reaction, which is really, he cannot believe it. He really cannot believe it. So I would say this movie is equally mocking women and mocking this man. I would say that.
Yeah, I think this is a valid point. I just think that there's something that I find very repugnant about the whole humor of the film, and it's not merely the misogyny, because I think that Hitchcock was probably misanthropist in any way. I mean, he didn't like people of any persuasion or gender or sex. I think there's something darkly lonely at the very heart of his films, but. I just think that when I was watching those scenes of courtship, and especially when we see one woman, which is Mary Hearn, who gets into this fit of hysteria, I think that probably the most interesting way to read this whole movie would be through some sort of psychoanalytical lens, because it seems like there's this all pent up desire, and at any even suggestion of finding a partner here, there's this either hysteria or fear. This Teresa character is also quite scary in the way that she seems basically like thin and emaciated by this long virginity of hers that she experienced throughout probably more than 40 years of her life. So if you remember Hitchcock's own experiences and his claim that he never was sexually involved with any women before Alma, and then even within the marriage they weren't too sexually involved, if we are to believe what he said many times to both privately and publicly. I believe it was a chaste marriage from a certain point on, at least according to Hitchcock's testimony. Then it's very strange, this whole film, like the idea that first, those women refuse him, but then one of them actually comes back and says, I changed my mind, and the whole idea of this very obscene and unpleasant to look at character of Cherdals Ash, played by Gordon Harker, who plays this sort of Shakespearean vulgarian character who basically speaks it as it is, like there are those very, very vulgar sentences that he says about marriage, and about the basic slavery element that is in marriage, especially for the men, from that perspective. It's just, I think I sense something, and I cannot really judge the film on basis on what I sense within it, but I sense something very ugly and unpleasant in the whole endeavor. Although I have to say that this is probably the most sophisticated film to date in Hitchcock's filmography in terms just of the psychological interplay between the characters, the looks, looks, the gazes, the gestures, the quite complex situation between many characters within a scene, like in the wedding feast and later on during the party. The camera actually pans back and forth, like to the right and to the left at the wedding party scene, just finding interesting guests to look at. And this freeing of the camera within a party situation made me think a little bit of Rope, for example, and the roaming camera in the later film by Hitchcock. So this is probably his most subtle film psychologically still. I mean, just in terms of how many different states of mind he shows. And also I agree, it's very beautiful in the early parts. We are in Devon, in the United Kingdom, and those rustic shots are beautiful. Also made me realize that actually Hitchcock was quite attuned to the natural world. We will see that in Under Capricorn. We'll also see that in the beautiful Vermont autumn scenes in Trouble with Harry, with all the beautiful leaves. Apparently, deeply British as he was, he had sort of inherited this tradition of English landscape and this appreciation for this rustic, simple beauty of beautiful English countryside. And yes, it's very pleasant in this film. It's much more beautiful and interesting visually than the South Seas of Pleasure Garden, which were quite banal in his take.
I agree, and I think many flaws of this film come from the this effort to transcribe or just translate a comedy like stage play, which is full of course Hitchcock mentioned it himself that it was of course full of dialogue, full of lines that they had to somehow transpose. And Hitchcock said that there are too many titles in this movie. I don't agree, there are not that many, so I think that's his impression, that's the way he remembered it. But I think many problems come from the it's not enough. It's not dramatically rich enough. For example, you mentioned the character of Charles Ash, whom I like, by the way. I think Gordon Harker is like the bright point of both The Ring, The Farmer's Wife, and, as we will discuss next time, Champagne. So, but for example, we have no idea why his attitude towards marriage is as it is. Of course, he's a kind of a local drunk, once again, as in The Ring, in which there was this in The Ring there was this striking POV shot of him being drunk, and his world was destabilizing. So in this movie, he's also this, as you mentioned, kind of Shakespearean Falstaff, or maybe that's saying a bit too much, but this comic relief. He functions as a comic relief in this movie, but we don't know why he's so against marriage, for example. We also, as we discussed already, we don't know why these women reject him. Actually, there is some, let's say, some very maybe subconscious almost note of feministic approach in that, because they like their independence and they say it out loud. They just like being, they are maybe also widows or just they are maidens, who knows. And the movie reminded me, I'm not sure if our English language listeners will know it, but there is this short story by Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, Maids of Wilko. And this movie is somehow, it's like the plot is similar, of course. And there is a movie which was Oscar nominated, by the way, by Andrzej Wajda. And there is this young man coming back to his hometown, like home village, let's say. And there are many single women who court him, so it's the opposite situation. I see you're smiling.
No, it's just that you are totally the winner of Jim Haberman Prize for the most unexpected association of two films. I really respect what you just did. Yes, this is a very interesting comparison. I can imagine the double bill of Maids of Wilko and this film. And by the way, both films have a streak of misogyny, because Wajda, which is rarely discussed, had this a little bit ugly streak of caricaturizing women. And all you need to do is, for example, to compare Teresa and Mary Hearn to the characters played by Krystyna Zachwatowicz and others in that film, and you will see that there's certain idea of femininity going to rot. Once a woman in this view, and interesting, Iwaszkiewicz was gay, Wajda was straight, Hitchcock was maybe both. We don't know, but there's this idea which I think is also deeply explored both consciously and unconsciously by modernist literature, that, once a woman passes a certain age and her flesh starts to change, she becomes monstrous in some ways. And you will see this in many films by Hitchcock. As long as the woman is a young girl, everything is fine. But then once she passes, into maturity, usually she becomes some sort of a caricature. And this is a deeper subject in those films and possibly in the culture in general. But yes, I mean, Gordon Harker plays this sort of vulgar character. His teeth are also rotting, and he's unpleasant to look at. And at some point, he says something like that sex is better than alcohol. That of those two like vices, it's better to have sex than to drink for a man. And also, I think that his deeply jaded view of marriage is interesting if you see and compare it with the view of marriage that the film itself holds, which basically, interestingly enough, is pure companionship. There is not a single instance in this film in which there would be even a hint of sexual desire of Jameson Thomas's character, Sweetland, towards any of the candidates. It's not like he's lusting after them. There is nothing like that. It's just that empty chair to fill, the companionship. And most interestingly, also, he's not lusting after the youngest of them all, which is, of course, Lillian Hall Davis, who has this very noble maiden look in the film. But really, Sweetland, it's not that he's, sexually hungry and he needs to fulfill that need. It's pure companionship. The idea is that, he needs a companion, he needs someone to talk to. We saw a marriage like that already in Hitchcock, actually, I think twice. The parents in Pleasure Garden, also the older couple in The Lodger. And it's interesting because actually we will discover something more about portraying sexual desire by Hitchcock in the next film, in Champagne. But there is also another thing, and this topic will come back next time. It will come back probably every single time when we discuss a Hitchcock film, because Donald Spoto actually wrote about it extensively, the association of sexuality and food in Hitchcock, and here this whole wedding feast of the daughter, when Sweetland looks at the people at the table, they are saying grace, and he imagines them already feasting and eating like very, very voraciously. It's just this contrast between this quiet prayer and this sort of gorging yourself on food that comes next. This contrast, but also he says to Minta after dinner that it was actually the food that gave him the idea to marry, because he says something like, "There's a memory of a female or two floating around in my mind, like last night's dinner." So it's like if you eat something and on the second day you still sort of feel the flavor of the food. And here again, like he says that, "Oh, I remember what marriage was. It's all like having a good dinner." So that's also interesting. But what about the performance by Jameson Thomas? Because this is a pretty big role and he has many scenes. How did you like his acting?
Yes, I liked his performance, and especially I liked the beginning of the movie, because you mentioned this idea of companionship, which is again and again expressed visually by this empty chair by the fire that has to be once again occupied by a woman to bring the order once again to the household. And I liked him in these first scenes, which show that his daughter is leaving and he's alone. And I like the way Hitchcock shot it, and I like the kind of expression that Thomas brings to these scenes. Of course, if you want another far-fetched association, I was thinking about the Yasujiro Ozu movies, which often again and again there is the same kind of plot that a child is leaving the house, and of course Late Spring is probably the most moving of these all. And so we have this lonely father in these several scenes, or maybe moments, several shots which show him when he's alone. And so that's why what's for me so fascinating, that I agree with you that there are so many, terrible misogynistic moments in this movie. But once again, it's one of the most subtle and empathetic, heroes we see. I mean, the father. We really are brought into his situation by visual means, by this fire. By the chair by the fire that he's sitting in, and this loneliness that is in this empty house. And I really liked it. Last time I mentioned that I couldn't become emotionally involved in the ring because I couldn't as a viewer, and this time I think maybe it's maybe my predilection for like this, let's say, easy empathetic effects that he's really bringing me into the character in a pretty straightforward way, but I think it works. So thanks to this beginning, which really establishes Thomas as a lonely widower, and we see him, we see him in the very first scene when he's close to to his dying wife. So he's not somewhere doing something, but he's really there. He's probably he loved her a lot, and several years pass before he's starting to think about, let's say, maybe not replacing him, but filling the empty place in his heart. So I think these small details, if we interpret it that way, really make him pretty sympathetic character, and they allow us to bear these horrible scenes. I want also to mention the gelatin desert, which is one of the scenes, which is the Hitchcock's visual metaphor for the anxiety that the woman is going through. She's shaking, she's terrified, and we see it by the way she holds this gelatin dessert, which is also shaking. So it's pretty cheap. It works, but it's another of this, as you mentioned, repugnant effects Hitchcock employs.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, this shot with the jello dessert, because this wobbly jelly structure is supposed to convey, the fear of the woman. On the other hand, I think, one could probably write a book, probably someone already did, about Hitchcock and obesity, the question of, let's say, excess of flesh. Because as we know, this was his problem throughout his life. This was the source of his great pleasure. That was also the source of his great complex. If you look at this film, in which actually Sweetland at one point says to one of the women that, I came to fetch you as a hen, as a fat hen. Like he's comparing the woman to a fat chicken. He's actually describing another of the women as pillowy, like having the shape of a pillow, and also this jello, which wobbles a little bit like excessive flesh. That's also often times someone's, for example, big belly is portrayed as wobbling, as a jello, because this is how excessive flesh looks like and feels like. I think that it's very interesting that all these that at least two of those women are in fact very big women, and also in the fact that the food again is such an important theme. I think there's this some sort of transition, or at least transference, between erotic appetite and actual appetite, and this idea of flesh, just too much flesh, let's say. So it was interesting to see, especially since it's also mentioned so many times in the dialogue, like fat hen, pillowy woman, and it's simply there. And I don't know what to make of it, but I know that there will be many instances later on when again he will be casting especially bigger women as as those figures of mockery, like in Rope, for example, this older lady who is the friend of the host. So interesting, think about portraying human flesh, but also, and probably this is the last thing I have to say about this film. I was thinking about the material. I think the material, I would like to see it produced on stage, because I think that actually, when I was thinking just about the plot and just about how it's constructed, I think it could be very sweet. It could be really, it all depends on the direction. If you direct it in a way that makes you sort of sympathetic towards all the characters, I think it may be a genuinely sweet play. It's not sweet as Hitchcock serves it. Mm-hmm. I cannot imagine, speaking of Jim Hoberman Award in comparison, but I cannot imagine what amount of sweetness and beauty a director like, for example, Leo McCarey would bring to this material. If you think, for example, of like Make Way for Tomorrow or something like that, I mean, this is a material for a genuinely beautiful, gentle story about finding your mate late in life and settling in for this quiet companionship with someone who was already close to you. There is this core of sort of very, very peaceful sweetness at the core of this material. It's not what I feel when I'm watching this film. I feel like, it's Hitchcock basically toying around with ideas of femininity and masculinity, and really finding every single opportunity to mock desire, mock flesh, mock this will to attach yourself to someone through a figure, for example, like this Gordon Harker. So it's a paradoxical thing. I think it's actually a material that could be quite comforting and maybe a little bit naive, but comforting. And it's not comforting for me to watch this film. I think it's actually quite bitter, somewhere deep inside.
Yes, I agree. And coming back to the topic of a comedy, I think that it will return later in movies like Mr. and Mrs. Smith. This notion that maybe Hitchcock wasn't, or maybe not maybe, that he surely wasn't a pure comedy director. That, comedy works in his movies almost always when it's, wedded to the thrill, to this other kind of excitement, I would say. That's why, North by Northwest, To Catch a Thief, they work so well because, there is this another kind of suspense which supplements the what is overall, what is generally a comedy, right? So I think that's why it's another of his movies that does not satisfy us, because he's trying so hard to be, in a way, to be funny, and I think it doesn't work, and I think that's another reason why he goes for this rough comedy, for this rough jokes, because he's really trying to make a real genre movie in this regard, but I think it doesn't work. But also, I would add also the shot of dogs at the very beginning, which is pretty beautiful. And I know that Charles Barr is writing about Hitchcock and dogs, and we'll probably come to it, because this is yet another moment, like in The Pleasure Garden, there is an important dog character, which even resolves the plot in a way. And here we also have at the very beginning this beautiful shot of two dogs next to each other, which are looking in a very sweet way at the Gordon Harker character, which is it's a out of the blue beginning. It's the very first shots before we even meet the farmer Sweetland. So there is a lot of this kind of let's say tender feelings in this movie, but overall I agree that there are really disturbing scenes. And just to sum it up, I mentioned that Truffaut said that these conversation scenes, when he's rejected, they are shot like a thriller. And I think because of this frontal placement of the camera, that we're looking straight at these women, it really creates this strange tension, because you mentioned that it's a purely, let's say, it's a good stage material, but it's shot in a totally different way, and Hitchcock kind of amplifies the tension in what is otherwise like the simple, two people talking to each other scene. So I think this is really strange. So I think we could maybe even overinterpret this movie by going deeper into these details of mise en scène in this case. But I agree with you that it's not one of his successful movies. And just I wanted to finish this part with the quote from Chabrol and Romer book, which of course treats Hitchcock from this evolutionary perspective, and they said that Hitchcock strayed from his true path in this movie, meaning that it's not a true Hitchcock movie, but it's something else, maybe one of his strange comedies that does not work very well.
Which is funny, because actually Eric Romer will remake this film in a fashion when he will make Le Bon Mariage in 1981, in which the main female character is set to marry at any cost. This was The Farmer's Wife, a film that remains divisive. I think actually we are divided within ourselves even, because we find things to like in it. We also find things not to like in it. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. Please like our fan page on Facebook, Foreign Correspondents Deeper into Hitchcock, and spread the word if you know of someone who is desperately dying to hear a podcast that is analyzing every single Hitchcock film in detail. Then please spread the word, because we are very eager to connect with our listeners. We also are to reach by email, hitchcock.podcast@gmail.com. Actually, we received some very nice notes from our listeners already, so thank you for all of those. And please tune in for the next episode of Foreign Correspondents
Deeper into Hitchcock.